So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to another one of these larger set piece sieges. This one of course we've seen in some form or another ever since the channel started really, because Helm's Deep has been in the Third Age Medieval 2 mods ever since then, albeit this version of it is the one that got a bit of a makeover for this version of the game. You have another entrance into the keep itself, you have a facsimile for the caves back here as well, which is an area that you can retreat to if you get pushed back from the walls, and there is an interior as well, a very narrow interior, so this does give you the opportunity as well to really set up some very narrow choke points even further back. Not that Helm's Deep ever didn't have that, of course it's one thing which the defenders have always been able to rely upon in this battle, but even though there are a few more options for the attackers, there's also more wiggle room for the defenders to pull back as well, which I think does give the battle more dynamism in every sense of the word. And this is also a completely lore-friendly battle because it is a full Isengard team on the attack and a combination of Rohan and Lothlorien on the defence. So potent forces all in their own ways, but we will go through the attacking armies first and foremost here, all of the Isengard forces. Actually Dunland as well joining in as well, which I didn't even notice these guys were around the corner, but Johnny playing as Dunland, and of course as we have spoken about Dunland and Rohan in the faction overviews up till this point anyway, we have not yet got to Lothlorien or Isengard. The Dunish warband being really the backbone of many a Dunland force, it's going to be a little bit more difficult for them to get good angles with their slings in a fortress as constricting, and with the sight lines that Helm's Deep offers, it very much favours the defenders unless you can take the walls, but by that point the battle is pretty much done and dusted anyway. Maybe not so much anymore that there's a little bit more retreating room for the defenders, but certainly if you're going to use the Dunish warbands their fullest, you're going to want to get them onto the fortifications and throwing their slings down into the streets below. But also they are one of the first lines of attack really in melee when it comes to Dunland, very much a hybrid unit this. The ruffians in behind, not so much, they're not quite as accomplished as the warband in melee, or I'd say accomplished, satisfactory in melee as the warband in front of them. They're very much a javelin unit first and foremost, and they're not really going to have much else in store other than their sheer numbers, but Dunland in terms of numbers, that is one of the main things that they do bring to the table. Several units of these Dunish warband as well. It's not surprising to see them either because they're relatively cheap and they do have a pretty high ceiling. The ruffians similar, slightly cheaper, again armor piercing, slightly more damaging missiles as well. The Ravenborn Wardens, as we mentioned in the Dunland faction overview, as far as a sort of highest level of foot-based infantry for a faction goes, they may not be all that impressive compared to other factions' units of this type in melee, but the fact that they are a bodyguard crossbow unit is still something which is very useful for them. Again, this is going to be heavily dependent on how well the attackers can take the fortifications and turn them against the defenders, albeit the Ravenborn Wardens are still a good enough unit in melee to the point where, alongside the numbers, they could prove to be a real problem to break down in the late game for the defenders. We'll see what Johnny wants to do with the Ravenborn Wardens, but I would imagine they're going to hang back and try and wait for the opportune moment, because if attackers can use crossbows in a situation like this, it's very difficult for the defenders to come back from if they're used effectively. In and amongst we have another unit of the Ravenborn Wardens as well, but we have here the Dunlanding pikemen with the armour upgrade as well. The helms are being donned and a little bit thicker furs that they're wearing as well. Not surprising to see pikes either. I imagine they're going to be a real part of the attackers' efforts here to try and seize control of certain areas, especially considering the more limited numbers of this kind of unit that the defenders are going to have access to. But of course they are also going to be one of the main things that missile units are going to be very good at, and close range missile units, Rohan have got plenty of them. Long range missile units, Lothlorien have got plenty of them. So they're not really going to be safe up until the moment they run out of ammunition really, and this is one of the first, or one of the most vulnerable kinds of units on the field, even with the armour upgrade, but still relatively cheap, numerous, and if you can get them situated, cheap pikes can really be a big value maker for you. The mounted Ravenborn Wardens, I mean Dunland don't have too many really expensive units to spend their money on, so it's not too surprising to see the Ravenborn Wardens here as well, even though I'd imagine there isn't going to be any sallying out on Helm's Deep. It's very difficult to escape into the open field without getting shredded, especially when you consider it's Isengard and Dunland, who are both good at anti-cavalry. But this unit as well, if you can use their crossbows, they're a little bit more versatile in terms of their speed. But we'll see. Cavalry on Helm's Deep is always a little bit of an interesting one to see if it will work or not. The Ravenborn, I mean, armour piercing is not necessarily the most important thing against Rohan and Lothlorien. It's still useful against both, but it's not really, really efficient in the way that it would be against many of the Western Kingdoms of Men or the Dwarves. But also when it comes to Dunland anyway, when it comes to aggressive units of infantry, for a reasonable price, the Ravenborn are going to be pretty much a constant bring anyway, and if you can get them in alongside those pikes, they're going to be a decently potent combination. But again, they do have a shield value, they wear their shields on their backs, but still going to be pretty vulnerable to missile attacks. Half-Orc Axeguard as well, so throwing axemen, again, much the same thing as the slings and the crossbows we've mentioned before. It really does depend on what sort of room and what sort of sight lines they can clear. The Dunnish Warband, and then over here we do have more of the Ravenborn pushing up this siege tower, but the Beastmen of Dunland are probably the scariest unit of infantry that Dunland have. They're not really bodyguard units in the same way that the Ravenborn Wardens are. Very damaging though. These Berserker class units, once they start to fade away though, they do tend to fall over pretty quickly, especially against high damage, high skill units like the Elves, and especially after they've taken a good amount of damage from missiles. But there are only so many missiles to go around, and as much as arrows are going to be effective against Dunland as a whole, I don't think they're going to be able to kill off all of them, especially seeing as some of the ammunition supply of the defenders will be used on Isengard over here. Tintin, 2,208, has got his Trolls of the White Hand, which Isengard are of course a far more robust faction overall than Dunland are in terms of their armour, in terms of their defensive abilities. The Trolls, however, are very much about their offensive capabilities. They'll be able to smash through lines. They need to be quite careful though. Both Rohan and Lothlorien have got plenty of aggressive units of infantry that can do damage to this kind of monstrous unit pretty fast. Uruk-hai crossbows, again, going to be saying the same thing for all of the missile units for the attackers here really, especially as most of them are high damage, close range sort of missiles, more mid-range for crossbows, but they need to get up onto the walls to be super effective, otherwise it's going to be very difficult for them to get their angles. The Nazkai, one of the best units of this type that the game has to offer, really strong armor piercing damage on these guys. If they can get in and amongst the fight against the right kind of force, they're going to be very, very powerful. Again, armor piercing not quite as efficient as it would otherwise be against these foes, but the damage and the effectiveness of their armor is still going to be good enough to keep them alive and swinging for a long period of time with all that damage. The Uruk-hai pikemen and Uruk-hai infantry is the main point of difference here. I mean, the Uruk-hai pikemen are far better than the Dunlanders that we've seen previously because they've got better stats and better equipment, better armor. But the Uruk-hai infantry offer them a foil in melee, which Dunland simply don't have really. Far more about their numbers and their wave of fodder, more so than the more professional, or at least more fearsome Uruk-hai, and certainly outfitted better as well. Snaga skirmishers, cheap javelins, same thing with the ruffians we've already seen, but this kind of unit is so cheap that you may as well bring them, because if they're efficient then they're really going to net you an awful lot of value. The Uruk-hai berserkers, more of a typical unit, the OG of this kind of unit really, in comparison to the Beastmen of Dunland that we've already seen. A couple more units of Uruk-hai infantry as well, and already pushing up. Actually, a few kills have already taken place here, so the missiles are already spewing forth from the keep. No need for a cut here. Uruk-hai Reavers, one of the more vulnerable units you could be choosing to push up the ram, but also one of the cheaper Isengard infantry units. Speaking of which, Banana over here has decided to bring quite a few of the Raiders, which obviously not as good as the Uruk-hai infantry. When you're on the attack, if you want to bring maximum numbers, that is definitely a valid course. And 253 in each of these Uruk-hai Raider units will still do the job. The Isengard Ballista, which differs from many Ballista in the game, although it's not completely unique in the sense that it is more all-round effective rather than the standard Ballista, which would take quite a while to get through these fortifications, but that isn't going to be quite so true for the Isengard one, so the wall is going to be put under scrutiny from very early on. The Guards of Orthanc, so really the best of the Dunlanders, are still on loan to Isengard over here. Saruman's personal guard, very heavily armoured, very defensive. Not going to be that good at dealing damage, but they will help tie the line defensively because they are just a big brick of armour, really. And then we've got the Uruk-hai infantry in behind them. Another unit of Trolls, plenty of the Trolls, so they're going to be difficult to bring down in numbers. Nazkai and Berserkers for the damage as well. Isengard, a very well-rounded force, of course, in their mid-tier to high-tier units, really. You can throw their bodyguards in as well with the Nazkai. A couple of units of Uruk-hai archers. They can balloon their shots over the wall a little bit more freely, perhaps, than the crossbows in behind them, but the same sort of thing really applies. The effectiveness of the attacking missiles will only truly be felt later on. And then we have Lila over here, or Lila. Half-Orc Baneguard is an interesting inclusion. We've got the Uruk-hai Raiders and Uruk-hai infantry once again, so armour piercing with some standard infantry alongside, more Trolls of the White Hand, more Uruk-hai archers and more Uruk-hai crossbows. The Wargs skirmishers, can see why they've been brought, because if the defenders did want to sally out, they would immediately be met with a unit that can deal with them, but they can still be used later on just for their javelins and also for their mass if it's the extreme late game. So I can definitely see the benefit to bringing that kind of unit. More Snaga skirmishers again, the Nazkai, Guards of Orthanc and Berserkers, so more of a varied unit composition here. And then the other wing of the army, several units of infantry and pikes, so the centrepiece of Isengard's army very often over here. Now then, for the defenders that are going to be facing down this intimidating looking force, Flame of the Rebellion, who sent this one to me, is going to be playing as one of the Rohirrim forces. We've got some Westmark infantry in here alongside the Riddermark Axemen. The Westmark infantry, as we mentioned in the Rohan faction overview, they are, individually speaking, very good, if not slightly better than many of their Western Kingdoms counterparts, because they have got slightly better stats all round. You know, their armour is not lagging too far behind the fully upgraded forces of the likes of Gondor and Arthedain either, but the numbers could be considered a little bit of a problem, only 133 per unit, so they are going to have to rely on that skill. But fortunately Helm's Deep does play into those hands somewhat if you're able to really take good map control and bottle the enemy up. That's where the superior quality of this kind of unit should come into play. And it's not as if you don't have numerous units either, and stuff like the Riddermark Axeman is going to be very useful here, because armour piercing is going to be very useful against Isengard on the whole, and Rohan are going to have to handle quite a lot of that. Lothlorien do have options in that regard, but Rohan is a far more central facet to what they tend to do. Eastmark Spearmen, mentioned them as well, very cheap, cheap as along the same sort of lines as sort of entry-level javelin units from evil factions. But they're also entry-level spears for Rohan, so decent in that regard. They're going to need to do as much damage with their missiles as possible, but again, another numerous unit this, alongside more Westmarks and more Riddermarks. The Eastmark Archers, which are going to be firing from the walls almost immediately. Far from the scariest archer unit on display today, but all of them will need to do their bit. China #1 here is another Rohan force. We've got several units of Riddermark Axemen ready to charge forth when the breaches occur. Shield Maidens are in here as well, going to be absolutely vital to Rohan's defensive abilities here. Big damage on them if they pick their targets well. It's exactly the sort of thing which can cause massive problems for the attackers. More Eastmark Archers and more Shield Maidens are in here, as well as the more intimidating Westmark Marshals in comparison to the Riddermarks. There are fewer of them, but this is exactly the sort of unit which will give the central units for Isengard in particular pause because of the big armor-piercing damage they're capable of chucking out, but they will need support around them, as many heavy axemen do, so their slightly lower melee defense values on average don't get exposed. A couple more units of Eastmark Spearmen as well, so they're definitely not lacking for throwing projectiles here. Rohan know where their bread is buttered. Helmingas as well, again a clever pick this, because they're going to be able, well, they're going to need to do maximum damage with their arrows, but also they're not as vulnerable as the Eastmark Archers in melee. They will still be able to chip in that regard. They're not amazing by any means, but every little helps, especially in this situation where you know everyone's going to have to pull their weight up close. Westmark Spears very good defensively, of course not as damaging as the Westmark Infantry you've already seen, but Spears have the edge defensively and they have the same numbers as well. We've got the Westmark Marshals, we have the Medicel Guard in here. They're going to be vital with their throwing projectiles and also their very strong melee stats as well. Helm Hammers though even eclipse their massive shield value and big armor piercing damage with those hammers as well. So near the Glittering Caves, where they presumably received their dwarven influence, Galathram Riders are in here, so a cavalry unit for the elves, but again they can be used more so for their Silverthorn arrows earlier on, and then late on, if you can escape into the open field, they can cause some havoc. Helmingas are over here. I mean, I'm surprised to see the Sons of Aeol. I mean, if the ballista does put a hole in the wall, or if the breaches are maybe not quite so attacked in an organised fashion by the attackers, they could be devastating, but it's a big investment of money. But then again, I suppose, as the defenders, you do have access to those increased funds. Galathram Archers and the Westmark Spearmen rolling down the hill as well, ready to defend this other avenue of attack. Cairn Amroth Rangers, so up here it's kind of role reversal really. Rohan defending the lower ground, the elves defending the higher ground this time, but that's the cleverer way to do it. I think T.S. Niehoff up here is going to have access to some very damaging archers indeed, and he's going to need to use the ammunition to big effect. Lurkin Shadow is here as well. Sindar Blade Masters already to defend the inner keep as well. Kindred of Caliborn, of course, devastating, as we've already seen in the recent siege for Dol Guldur. The Kindred of Caliborn were nearly able to pull out a victory where I didn't think it was possible. So we'll see in this sort of situation whether they can, whether it's second time lucky for them. Eastmark Spearmen and more Rohirrim defending over here as well. So it's 3 Rohan armies and 1 elven force, so the quality of Lothlorien with Galathrun warriors and Galathrun nobles, kindred, they are very present, but it's going to have to be Rohan that this victory is built on the backs of, because there are simply more of them. Elmingas, another unit of Sons of Yule, so big investments from the cavalry here. If they can escape into the open field, they could be a real menace. Westmark Marshals and HELMS Hammers here once again, so again going to be really reliant on that Rohan armour piercing both from the lances of their cavalry, from the ends of the axes and from the tips of their javelins here. The elves just acting as that quality foil, especially with their archers, to try and help see them over the line. But I suppose, given that things are already underway, given that the ram has already been pushed up and there are already corpses on the floor, we will get this show right on the road. An intimidating sight from the Uruk-hai perspective here as they push the ram up towards the gates. Now, I do think this is going to be rather two-pronged, because I don't think they're going to get fully underway until Dunland move over here to reinforce them, but also here in the centre, unsurprisingly, the Isengard ballista is going to start peeling away at the lower wall. And the more gaps they can open in this, I think the better, because generally speaking, when you go through on foot through these walls, unless you intend to use the walls yourselves, which that isn't really going to be the case on Helm's Deep on the outer wall, you're going to be far more likely to utilise the inner wall to your own means as the attackers. But if you don't intend to utilise them at all, then you're far better off poking holes in them rather than trying to use siege towers and ladders. You can see that already as well. The Eastmark archers, the lowliest of all the defending archers today, but all of this ammunition will still be very much needed if they are to have victory. I'm a little bit surprised actually the ballista isn't going after the section of wall that they're on. I think they see now that they are going to have to retreat, otherwise they will suffer the fate of falling from the walls. Elmingas also firing down into these units. The Reavers will fall pretty quickly under any sort of arrow fire. Those leather scraps not quite up to the same level of armour as the rest of Isengard tend to have. Uruk-hai infantry will be better placed for dealing with this arrow fire with their armour and shields, but if they do face the wrong way, they will still take their fair share of casualties, and they are completely out in the open here as the Medieval 2 siege engine pathfinding does its thing. Tintin removing his units, the siege tower's facing the wrong way. Controls the White Hand pushing up the siege tower as well. I mean, obviously the ideal shock troops in that sort of situation. The ram does breach the gates, but as is very often the case in Helm's Deep, it's never really been seen, at least in any battles that I've showcased here, that the attackers manage to force their way into this ring and take it before the lower section of the fortress has been largely secured already. Isengard ballista making short work of the lower outer wall. Banners of Rohan displayed proudly on the inner ring of the fortress. Still, a few of the archers continue to go about their business. Elmingas reasonably well here. Uruk-hai raiders rushing forwards now as well, through the gaps in the wall perhaps. Are they going to immediately charge their way in? 2 units of Uruk-hai raiders will not be sufficient to claim any sort of ground for any length of time, given the level of defenders that are behind here. Primarily the Rohirrim, though, it is worth pointing out. They won't have to deal with the extreme high end of Lothlorien until they get through to the inner level of the fortress, I think. Flaming arrows now making their way forwards, or down onto the enemy units. You're unlikely to break them at this early stage. You might be able to break these units, and indeed they do. 1 unit of Uruk-hai Reavers, for the same reason as not committing the raiders down on the lower ground. It was never really going to end too well for just 1 unit to charge in through the gate and expect to be able to overcome a well-prepared Rohirric defence. Westmark Spearmen holding the line nicely. Good defensive bastion kind of unit that Rohan have access to. Elmingas continuing to fire down, and many of Tintin's units are still exposed, so I don't know how efficient these shots are. In Uruk-hai infantry, a lot of them are facing the wrong way as well, so yeah, not necessarily the worst thing to do a good amount of damage here. All of these units are fleeing. They should return though, they're fairly healthy, which means they will have to be dealt with again, but we'll see. Slugger skirmishers now moving forward to try and put some pressure on, throwing some javelins in through the gap to try and soften those Rohirrim infantry units up a little bit. exposed at this point as well. I mean, Rohan will have to try and get out of harm's way. I wouldn't really recommend counter-attacking outside of the gates. That's exactly what Isengard would want. Meanwhile, Rohan doing some hit and run here with their Sons of Eorl, and none of them actually fleeing, or none of them dying. The Uruk-hai Raiders very much fleeing, however. It's been a good start for the defenders, this. Excuse me. Westmark's doing a decent job, and I was a little bit concerned about how this cavalry could be used, but it's an ideal way of earning some early value with a very expensive unit. Of course, dealing with a couple of units of Uruk-hai Raiders is not going to be the be-all and end-all in this fight, but the tone has been set early on here, and it's in favour of the defenders, I would suggest. There's still plenty left to go here. Meanwhile, mounted Ravenborn now moving forwards. Going to try and use their crossbows from horseback. Slightly different angle of fire that mounted crossbows have as well. They can fire over their own units more easily when they're in this sort of situation. You can see here some javelins, some of the attacking archers, rightly trying to focus down some of the more vulnerable units like the Riddermark Axeman. Although maybe crossbow bolts is a little bit overkill for a unit like this. Raiders continuing to get charged into oblivion by not only the Rohirrim cavalry but also the Galathrim riders. Plenty of attackers still there though, stretching all the way back to the raised terrain in the far distance. Dunland's cavalry may have arrived, but their infantry is yet to arrive en masse, so that will be something else to consider. Riddermark Axemen against the Uruk-hai Raiders. Interestingly enough, this is one matchup where perhaps the Riddermark Axeman won't be as efficient, because that armour piercing isn't really going to be as effective against these entry-level Uruk-hai as it would be against certain other foes, perhaps. Only the one unit of Riddermark Axeman trying to hold on to the walls as well, and they won't last on their own like this. Their lower defensive values will be exposed a little bit, but several Uruk-hai being bisected by the two-handed axes. More Uruk-hai Raiders moving forward from Lila's army. Still plenty of reinforcements that Rohan can commit. Uruk-hai archers firing their payload over the wall, going after the Galathrim archers, a few of them falling. Again, not the best quality of archers that Isengard have, but this is still something that needs to be remedied from a defending perspective. What have we got going on here? Well, I mean, Isengard now have a free pathway up onto these walls, which is a bit of a problem. Early on they were doing quite well, but this is a little bit of an oversight, I would suggest. I mean, there are these Galathrim warriors right in the way, but if Isengard can get a conveyor belt of units going up here, they could be able to shut down some good firing positions. I did say that I think counter-attacking out here would be maybe a little bit too risky, but that's exactly what Rohan have done, some Helmengas pushing back against the Isengard advance. But as much as these guys can get involved in melee, they're not going to be on the same level as dedicated Uruk-hai infantry. I think they see that because they're going to retreat back into defensive shape, which is definitely the right call, I think. Isengard now start to surge forward once more. Those units that have returned are now certainly a more intimidating looking advance now, with the trolls at the centre of it and plenty more in terms of infantry moving forwards. To that in just a moment. The Riddermark Axemen got left behind. These attacks that are still happening on foot, utilising flaming shot over here, I think is a slightly more viable idea, given the lowlier nature of the raiders and the precariousness of their situation. Of course, the Rohirrim cavalry also causes fear when it charges in, so the raiders' morale could start to fall apart once again, still taking punishing strikes. The Isengard ballista crew, so the ballista using up all of its ammunition to open up holes in the wall, which I don't necessarily think is the wrong call. It can of course be used against defensive positions, but there's no guarantee you're ever going to get the angle for that, so utilising it early to do as much damage to the fortifications as you can. I think a few of the bolts sailed over, I don't know whether they hit anything though. So far, Westmark infantry and spearmen performing very well as the heart and soul of the Rohirrim infantry force. Lower numbers not proving to be too much of a problem just yet, but the defensive positions have been well crafted to try and lessen the impact of that. Essentially all coming in like in and out like the tide here. unit I was probably most worried about from a cost efficiency standpoint is definitely proving its worth here. Another unit of Riddermark Axemen making its way into melee. Try and crack through that Uruk-hai armour. Will be successful in that regard as well. Eastmark Spearmen. Some of these units have chased the enemy quite far, trying to get into some of these supporting skirmishers, but a single unit of Uruk-hai Raiders is not going to be up to the task of doing that. Bathroom Archer's still there. So far it has been Rohan-led, these efforts. Lothlorien leaving quite a lot in reserve for later perhaps, but some Lorien Spearmen now in here. More of a presence definitely needed on this front line with the Trolls and with plenty more of the Isengard units moving forward. The first instance of Uruk-hai Pikemen being committed as well to try and establish some sort of dominance in a melee fight in that respect. Rohan, of course, without any sort of phalanx units of their own. But this is the ideal kill box for archers. Although the Reavers are wavering, Javelins also in support, very close range from the Eastmark Spearman. We'll be getting some good damage done. The ability to sustain this is really what's going to determine whether or not this was the correct move from the attackers or not. Arrow fire. Calamorn were there as well, and the Galathrim nobles. Helm's Hammers as well. I mean, the Helm's Hammers will definitely be a unit that is capable of dealing damage to these trolls in good order. You can see the flashes of the axes moving forward as well, so another unit of the Reavers. And there you see the Helm's Hammers. Big Great Shield units. Kind of unit which tends to have very, very good mass pushing capabilities, albeit the Helm's Hammers are a little bit different to the Orcish equivalents because they have a smaller unit size in general, but you can see there they've actually completely cut off the trolls and some of the Uruk-hai infantry here with, as a result of that push, some elves also standing in the way as well, so it's a bit of a chaotic fight, but I think the defenders have responded pretty well to a fairly scary looking advance. I mean, the trolls are still going to be capable of doing a lot of damage, especially to all the Rohirrim spears. Not the ideal opponents that they would pick. Elven archers though, level of damage they can chuck out is certainly very impressive. Meanwhile, the lower walls, starting to see a little bit more of a presence over here now, securing some of the high ground with some of the siege towers. Uruk-hai berserkers here as well, but again, good use of the Sons of Eorl, and that was a charge that did connect. Several of these berserkers falling away, going toe-to-toe with the Westmark Marshals. It's a fight the berserkers would win under normal circumstances, but taking hits from those Silverthorn arrows and charges from the Rohan Knights means that that is not the case any longer. And throwing axes as well, being thrown high. So again, I think they've responded pretty well to everything the attackers have done so far, the defenders. It's just whether or not the lower numbers of the factions that they are can withstand this sort of thing over the long haul. One thing that the attackers really don't want to happen is for their assaults to start faltering completely. They definitely need to keep them going because, again, it is that staying power. In particular, Rohan may start to suffer under as the battle goes on, but so far even stuff like the Riddermark Axemen have shown themselves to be useful against opponents greater than themselves. Snaga up here on the walls. They should probably, I mean, it's wide open here for them to try and counteract these Snaga, to be honest. Galathrim warriors now doing just that, streaming down, and scarcely will you see a more one-sided battle than this. Snaga, of course, not exactly well known for their prowess in melee. Those Lorien axes will do their grisly work. Ruffians now arriving. I think this is the first example of a melee fight, at least that we've seen, that Dunland have managed to get a unit into. Trying to get some javelin, more javelin support perhaps, but some more Dunlanders arriving, some pikes streaming in through these gaps. But again, it's going to be the defending support which is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting. Eastmark Spearmen managing to get a volley off onto the Ruffians. Large amounts of damage. Riddermark Axemen pushing up onto the walls actually and closing the door that was open. And Uruk-hai crossbows that were setting themselves up to fire, so that's the right idea by Lila, but no, well, insufficient support and defence for them to be able to set up just yet. Meanwhile, very little remains of the attack is being dealt with now, the shield maidens rushing forth into melee to assist the heavy axemen that were already here. More streams of units. Pikemen again trying to establish themselves. That is one way that they can bully these factions around a little bit using those long weapons, but still plenty of supporting units to be able to deal with that sort of thing for now. Plenty of archers, some Uruk-hai archers managing to get further into the settlement, trying to shut down some of these supporting units, which you can definitely see why, but it's tough. Units, more Westmark marshals, and flooding forward with another wave of these heavy axemen. That's a lot of damage heading the attacker's way. And having a look, I mean, the numbers still stretch pretty far back. I mean, quite a lot of these reinforcements are pretty far away. Should probably get a little bit closer just in case they are needed. Karen Amroth Rangers firing down from on high. Plenty of good choices of targets down there as well. Clear shots also. You can see here trolls still causing a problem, and actually the attacker's starting to establish a beachhead within the fortress now, but again, they must be taking an awful lot of damage. Kindred of Caliborn, I would assume they've used up their ammunition. They're now the centrepiece of this defence, and if there is a unit that can withstand trolls, this would definitely be one of them that's on the field today. The HELMS Hammers did barge their way in and then retreated. They are now coming back to help reinforce, both with... one of the trolls actually died from a flaming arrow there. Trying to get up onto the walls now. I mean, they will do that, but there is a unit of Sindar Blade Masters waiting for them. The troll's already heavily bloodied. I would imagine that they should be okay. Shield Maidens still there. HELMS Hammers barging their way in once again, causing confusion in the Isengard ranks, and then once again retreating. Amroth Rangers and Galathrun Archers still firing away. Unsurprising given the Uruk-hai pikemen, and also situated in the ideal position to do some damage are the Shield Maidens. Big damage on the Shield Maidens. Even the shielded units are probably not going to have that bonus to their defence, given the makeup of these units, and surely now the trolls are going to start to fall away. They're already heavily damaged, and they are now surrounded, taking throwing axe hits, and 2 units of Sindar Blade Masters nearby. Throwing projectiles can be effective against these kinds of units if they're static like this. One of the Isengard generals does fall, stuck up against the wall as he was. I assume that's Tintin's then. It depends really on how many reinforcements they have. Berserkers on the way forward. Dunland, probably going to be the final wave actually, Dunland, because a lot of their units are still in reserve, but I don't know whether they're going to have the quality to face down. If it does come down to Dunland versus Lothlorien in the late game, it's going to be tough for them. Still not a huge amount of progress being made over here either. Westmark Marshals doing a good job. Sniper skirmishers as well, trying to get into place. Secured the walls as well, pretty much completely. There is a section of Isengard units facing off here, but again, Westmark Marshals and Riddermark Axemen standing in the way. Big armour-piercing damage. Also, some of the Helmengas offering their support as well. Many of those arrows finding their mark and adding to the damage and Isengard's woes. Still got units of trolls in reserve, though. We've already seen how effective they can be at breaking open a defensive position, and as Rohan get more and more tired, the more effective that kind of hammer blow would be. However, unless they're going to commit reinforcements, this attack does run the risk of completely running out of steam. I guess we'll see. On the walls, Galathrun warriors. There's one Snaga in there trying to take pot shots, but he's missing. Hitting the siege tower instead. Some of these units being retreated. Helm Hammers. Mark Archers is an interesting unit to retreat, but there you go. Arrow fire going after the Uruk-hai crossbowman. Again, the effectiveness of this kind of unit is really dependent on what sort of positions Isengard and Dunland can claim. Helming gas. And javelins. Might be a little bit overkill at this point. I think the Rohan infantry will be able to handle things on their own. A unit of Guards of Orthanc arriving though. It's only more of a solid unit. Helmingas will struggle to do much damage to them, but the javelins may be ideally placed to gain a bit of value in that respect. Eastmark archers looping their arrows in. Ravenborn wardens trying to exert some pressure, maybe try and use their cavalry in the same way the defenders have been able to use it thus far, but it's going to be hard, especially with the presence of spears and the fact that there isn't really an obvious gap to go for. Back within the fortress though, this is where Isengard were having a bit more luck, but you can see here that some berserkers have taken the place of the trolls, but they're very much suffering from the same sort of thing. I mean, as soon as the berserkers' hit points are expended, the Sindar Blademasters are one of the more ideal kinds of units for facing off against them. Galathran nobles in close proximity as well, try and deal with that high priority target as quickly as they possibly can. Helm Hammers have, again, in much the same way as the cavalry, sort of gone in and out of the engagements and tried to affect it in what ways they can. You can see the Dunnish warband starting to poke their heads in through the main gate. Galathran archers. Dunlendings going to have to take up more and more of the slack here, you would think. Westmark marshals guarding the wall. Don't think they necessarily need to though. The Galathran warriors are already there. Seeing a little bit more action from the Sons of Eorl, who at this point are starting to look a little bit haggard, but that's to be expected. They've been active pretty much since the battle got underway. Another nice charge though. Good bits of damage, but they have started to ramp up the pressure once again, the attackers. More Isengard units joining the Dunland pikemen within the walls. Uruk-hai crossbows starting to try and do some damage as well. Going after the axemen that are on the walls. Westmark marshals, a unit which should be well placed for dealing with the high armour of the Guards of Orthanc, but I don't know whether the Guards of Orthanc could simply outlast them with their superior defence. Skirmishers still in close proximity as well. They can be used for their javelins. Still good support coming in as well. Fire arrows going to try and break off this attack as well. In conjunction with the cavalry charges, that is a very real possibility. It's a little bit worrying for the defenders though. Uruk-hai pikemen starting to surge forward, but are they biting off more than they can chew again? They've tried this a couple of times already to try and really get into the heart of these skirmishers, but they haven't had the sure position to stand in when they've done that, and it's just resulted in many of their units routing. Been impressed with the Rohan heavy axemen in this fight though. Against the rank and file of Isengard, that is one of the better opponents for them. But in particular, I think the lower end axemen, the Riddermark axemen, have actually been one of the main bases for the defence so far. In conjunction with that support, they've been able to dish out a good amount of damage to the Uruk-hai. Throwing axes. Falling down from on high. That, however, I think, might be a sign that the half-orc axemen are here. If some of them are targeting the Rohirrim. Again, the defensive tools used by the defenders so far have been more effective, but the attackers do have their own in reserve, and we're starting to see some of them now. If they can make good use of them in the late game, that could be the turning point that the attackers need, and the Trolls now moving in with the Guards of Orthanc is a big statement. I don't think Rohan are going to be able to hold on from here. The Trolls moving forward was always going to be the moment where the defence would likely meet its demise, given how much effort they've already put in. And they've timed it well, because there's also now new units heading up onto the walls, putting pressure on Rohan from multiple angles so they can't focus down the main point of the defence. Galadhrim archers moving in, Eastmark spearmen in good numbers. Cavalry still going to be a concern for Isengard as they move forward, because any gaps that are found by the cavalry will result in an awful lot of damage, but the Trolls of the White Hand are now going to be able to really hound what remains of the supporting skirmishers back here, and with all the infantry moving forward through the walls, you would imagine this is where the defence is going to start to creak. Amounts of damage being done by the throwing axes, but not resulting in any kills just yet. Again, these units can take multiple hits per unit because of the size of them, but they're still tanky enough to be able to withstand, especially with the shields actually. Troll shields means that they can, throwing axes do have their damage cut down a little bit by shields. Flaming arrows being launched from up high. Got to be a little bit careful though. Perhaps a little bit more likely to cause some routing among the Rohirrim if you're not careful. But any sort of, well, say that, the Uruk-hai pikemen did just rout. Even regular arrows against pikes are always going to be a good thing, of course. Huge amounts of projectiles still being loosed. You can always tell because the frame rate dips a little bit whenever there's a hailstorm of projectiles like that. Again, I do think that the attackers will eventually secure this position, but the damage that they're taking in doing so is pretty extreme. They prove to be the ultimate difference maker as the battle enters its final stages. Which we seem certain for the Uruk-hai infantry. The Uruk-hai crossbows start to flee. Gas looping their shots in. Beastman of Dunland. Big commitment of a unit as well, another Berserker class unit. Yeah, it really is just going to come down to how much damage can the defenders do to the attackers as they secure all this ground. It is also going to be interesting to see, I think, what the status of things in here is, and defenders have done very well. They've managed to effectively force the attackers back out of the fortress. That's a big gain for them as well, especially when you consider that the one unit of long weapon infantry they have in the Guardians of Caras Galadhrim are going to be able to stand watch at the gatehouse as well. Beastmen of Dunland and Ravenborn, so plenty of aggressive damage-dealing infantry from Dunland trying to make an impression, but the defenders will be very pleased with how this is looking over here. They have enough left in reserve as well to be able to reorganise a defence within the walls, so that is going to be where we stand. Uruk-hai infantry. Again, more and more these engagements are starting to favour the attackers in this section of the fortress. More of the Ravenborn of Dunland now moving forward. Shield Maidens in place. Ravenborn Wardens as well. Could still yet be the key in this battle, whether or not the attackers are able to really utilise things like their crossbows to make up for the damage that they've taken. The Trolls going to hit these Helmengast from both sides, going to stand and shoot, which is probably more likely to result in kills against a unit like the Beastmen of Dunland, but they're going to have to pull out their swords and shields now, and they're not going to last very long under this kind of pressure, unfortunately for them. Trolls of the White Hand. Still these Galadhrim riders in here, but they are stuck in these caves. There is no way to get into the fortress itself from here. Hunting down these trolls, what a weird sort of engagement that is. defeat seems certain. These poor men left behind, no retreat for them. It will have to be a fight to the bitter end. I'm sure they won't mind that too much. Uruk-hai, Helmingas, up on the walls, still loosing flaming arrows, although against the Ravenborn, and especially against the Guards of Orthanc, there's going to be no routing. It's easier to see what units are getting killed in that situation though, but now pressure, stuck on the tower, is now going to be coming in from multiple angles. The main gate, still an attack happening there, but also being pressured from the side now. Uruk-hai infantry, although on their own against these kinds of odds, it's not going to end very well for them unless they get immediate reinforcements from behind. Over here, slightly more favourable engagement for the Ravenborn, albeit we know that Elven archers can still more than hold their own in melee. It's just really the numbers discrepancy at this point which would lead you to believe that the Dunlanders will have victory here. Further back, Karen Amroth Rangers. Westmark Marshals arriving on the front line as well, in addition to the Helms Hammers, who they've been used in the sort of traditional Great Shield infantry fashion very well by the defenders in this battle so far. It's been more about that perhaps than their sheer prowess. The Elven General calls. Always likely when you're being used, when you have your general in a marauding cavalry unit, that's how they're going to meet their demise. Hammers really pushing back now though. Interesting choice. I mean, I suppose, you know, they haven't fully secured the lower fortress yet. There's still pockets of resistance, so they can set themselves up as they might like. So it's a good opportunity to try and go after some more vulnerable units that have been sent forward on their lonesome, getting just that little bit more value. All of that should add up as we get into the latter stages of this one. We've got going on here, Galathram Nobles. Further over, Ravenborn still on the front line. We've still got the Dunland Pikes, but going up against the equivalent Pikes from Lothlorien, especially in this sort of situation where you can't really take advantage of your superior numbers because of how narrow the avenue is. It's going to be a problem for you. From the back, Dunnish Warband, axes drawn. Is this the last unit they have over here? For the moment it is. So they're going to be very much placing their faith in other attacks. This one really is just designed to keep more of the defenders occupied at this stage. And I mean, they are occupying the pike unit, but still. Narrowing the battlefield is something which the defenders are going to want to do 9 times out of 10. So they'll be quite happy with how this is going. Looks like they might be sending some Westmark Marshals over there to try and really twist the knife, as it were. More and more units arriving on the front line now. Beastmen of Dunland, some Uruk-hai infantry meeting the Marshals in combat. So plenty of time in this battle left, and they do have plenty in reserve over here, the attackers. Just whether or not they want to send over some reinforcements to assist their fellows over there. And to be fair, this is an excellent angle of fire that the Uruk-hai crossbowmen have, hitting the sides of the units as they try to advance out of the keep. And if they can get any shots at all, any good shots onto the Karas Galadon's Guardians, that is huge value that they can make. For the time being, it's going to be Shield Maidens and Marshals that take the brunt of that damage, but those bolts are going to be very much needed, because there's no way really these attacking units would be victorious otherwise. Are they routing? No, they're pulling back, which is a bit of a strange one. The presence of those crossbow volleys is convincing the defenders to fall back within their fortifications. Uruk-hai infantry moving forward, trying to coax the attackers in a little bit now. Medicel Guard moving forward. I mean, surely this battered and bruised unit of Uruk-hai infantry is going to rout in short order. Defeat is a distinct possibility. Helms Hammers moving over here. Still a couple of trolls left alive, but in the taking of the lower fortress, they too got beaten up. Over here, the Ravenborn in support of them, or what remains of them. And we've got the Staff Masters over here, a unit whose main selling point is their extremely high melee defense, so I don't know how many of those heavy axe blows are actually going to be landed on them. They had a parry quite nicely. Dunlanding pikemen trudging uphill as well. Chilblains of Rohan waiting to use more of their throwing axes. So they are going to be able to re-enter the main gate, try and put some pressure on once again, but they won't have the benefit of the support of those crossbows any longer. The elven pike units and staff masters already and waiting. The warband are the first ones in, and many of them get skewered right off the bat. Need to be a little bit careful with their pike formations here though. Still a reasonably heavy unit, or healthy unit of Sons of Eorl. If they can escape out of here, if they can deal with Dunland and then away into the open fields, Sons of Eorl could cause havoc among the rear lines of the attackers. Escalating here, still the odd flaming arrow from the Helmengast. I don't know necessarily how many arrows the defenders have left in stock, but I mean, you can't really argue with the results of what they've done with them so far. Plenty of kills. Good routing, playing the Rebellion with point-blank shots into the Uruk-hai. Although, our Blade Master's being attacked by the Beastmen of Dunland, and the Helmengast are now going to be made to pay for this, because they're going to have to go into melee against the Nazkai, the scariest unit of attacking infantry on the field. And seeing their presence may be enough to rouse the Medicel Guard into melee, although that's not a fight that they would enjoy either. Very well balanced, but they really do lack the extreme high-end damage that the Nazkai are able to kick out. Smart marshals are there. Trolls are still alive, although I think the Westmarks have only just arrived. Those heavy axe blows should be enough to finally bring those two down. Half-orcs, Guards of Orthanc, and the Dunish warband leaving this area. Large amount of Dunlanders actually. Are they going to try and head towards the main gate again? Still got Silverthorn arrows as well. I mean, the natural target for them is surely going to be the Nazkai. Decent attack in terms of numbers, but the quality just isn't here for Dunland. Maybe that's why those other units of warband are on their way over to try and do the same sort of thing. Smart marshals loitering with intent. And the Medicel Guard still doing their thing as well. Helm's Hammers, I mean, the armour piercing of the Helm's Hammers, they are more of a defensive unit naturally, but considering the arrow fire that they're taking as well, the Nazkai will struggle here. It's been a real slog for the attackers in this battle. I think the defenders do deserve credit for setting up a well-organised defence. They've made good use of their supporting units and even cavalry, and again the Helm's Hammers moving in 2 units of them, and you can see that units get sent flying back. I mean, when Snaga skirmishers are making up a decent portion of your attacking force, then this sort of thing is going to cause some problems in your ranks. That much is for sure. We're bearing down on the final 10k frames now. And it will be a battle for the interior of the fortress. I don't know necessarily whether they're going to get further than this ring. I think from a defending perspective, it may be worth your time to just, if it ain't broke, don't fix it sort of thing, where they just hold up here. Uruk-hai, crossbowman, taking some pretty significant damage from the Galathrin warriors. I mean, situating the crossbows up on these walls is something they absolutely want. Maybe they don't have a choice but to try and put the pressure on in this way. Trying to get charges within the Helm's Deep Fortress is difficult, but the Sons of Yore are giving it a good go against the Beastmen of Dunland here, who are starting to fall away again under the attention of those elven silver thorns. It's always going to be quite difficult for them. Over here, meanwhile, more of the Westmark Marshals. Not be so sure of that, but the other units of Dunland Warband are here now, trying to use their slings to give them some sort of edge over the elven pikes. Escalating are there as well, to act as a high quality unit up close should the need arise. What's going on there? Escalating falling back a little bit. Don't know if there's necessarily any need for that. The Helm's Hammers alongside the Westmark Marshals, huge armour piercing damage, and that's a bad sign for, in particular, the Guards of Orthanc. At least the Uruk-hai Pikes can try and hold them further back, but another unit of the Westmark Marshals moving over here to keep this attack in check, which they've done quite well so far, although they will be slightly concerned about the number of Dunlanding pikemen over here. It'll be a slow process to move forward, but the pikes could facilitate it. Back down here, Escalating. I mean, this is the only unit they have left fully in reserve, I think. So the numbers of the defenders are starting to dwindle. Yeah, this attack in the main gate. How many warband units have they got? A fully healthy one there, and another one here. They've also got their Ravenborn Wardens, so Dunland have got a fair amount of strength here at the main gate, but it's whether or not they can situate themselves just so, and they need to try and use those slings to good effect as well. This will be a concern. The trolls. And immediately the attention of a couple of units of javelins, and one of them is the Escalating, so that's going to be big javelin damage coming their way, and the trolls getting bloodied pretty quickly. Also, they're slightly depleted now, but it is a unit of Galathran warriors they're facing in melee, which is going to be a better counteracting unit for the trolls up close than many others. Shield Maidens also, so even at this late stage there's still some ranged support for the defenders. That could be the difference between victory and defeat, honestly. Sons of Aor charging around. Hammers still doing their thing, but more limited in number now, maybe pushing a little bit too far into the enemy ranks. Still a couple of Staff Masters, but it's mostly just this one unit of Westmark Marshals which is holding back the tide over here. Like I said, it's not too much of a problem. Again, Nazkai are in here now. Nazkai and Pikes. It's a big ask for these guys to hold on for a length of time. They'll do okay initially, but as the battle goes along, they're going to struggle. Trolls making some progress along the walls. The Staff Masters engaging with the Dunish warband that were being a bit of a pest at the main gate. Elsewhere, Shield Maidens, Sons of Aor, Helm Hammers. There's the Guards of Orthanc. Much left in reserve for the defenders is the main issue here. A few units in some really good positions. They've got some really high quality stuff as well, like a couple of units of Escalating. Still the small matter of these Galathran nobles in melee as well. They managed to force their way forwards, the trolls, but a few of them have died. Guards of Orthanc still there. The pikes have now shifted to go over to the other side, not needed against the Dunlanders any longer. Escalating moving across. And if they do get into melee with the Galathran nobles, I think that would be the end of the trolls, especially if they get the support from the Medicelds. much damage can they do, is the question. Still those 19 Helmingards. Taking pot shots where they can. Another unit that, I mean, this will be a concern. They finally managed to clear a spot, and the Uruk-hai crossbows are now on the walls. The choice of target is going to be interesting here, but this is what the attackers have been waiting for pretty much the whole battle. They're going to be taking a few odd arrows, but I think they're going after something down there. Or are they trying to go after the two bodyguard units in behind the trolls? Don't really have the angle for that if they are. Shield Maidens of Rohan. I think as a result of that, yeah, immediately the Helms Hammers and those Westmark Marshals are going to make their way up here and interrupt the crossbows. Definitely the right thing to do. And deal with those as quickly as they possibly can. The Guards of Orthanc. Victory is a distinct possibility. How long will that last with the pressure from the Rohirrim now making its way up onto the walls? Isengard not able to force their way through the Guardians of Caras Galadon either. Again, the defenders have had every answer so far. I think it's really just a case of whether or not their manpower holds itself together long enough to see themselves over the line. Medicel Guard now joining the defence over here, a more worthy foe for the Nazkai. Again, if it were 1-to-1 you would still back the Nazkai there, but they've been in melee a little while longer. We'll have to wait and see. Another of the enemy generals falls up on the wall. Sons of Eor charging into the Uruk-hai crossbows. I mean, they're not going to last very long now. They've got decent armour, but they're certainly not melee combatants, really. The Uruk-hai crossbows using bayonets as their primary melee weapon. Victory is almost a certainty. Pikes still doing their thing. Medicel Guard. Victory seemingly certain. They and the Galathran nobles. Another unit of Medicel Guard as well. This is where the quality that they still have left in the tank really ought to be enough to see them over the line, especially as things get more stretched. If those Sons of Eorl can manage to escape into the open field, in real trouble. The Dunland warband, Dunish warband, not able to get through the Shield Maidens and Staff Masters. Again, this fight over here really has been more of an occupying measure for quite a while at this point, unless the Ravenborn can somehow make an impression. I don't think they're going to be making any sort of progress over here. Caras Galadon's Guardians still doing their thing. And normally Isengard would be thrilled to get involved in a pike battle, but 1-to-1, depending on what you prioritise, the Lothlorien pikes are the strongest unit in the game. Shield Maidens, Nazkai, Guards of Orthanc. I mean, considering the situation they've been in, they've held out quite well upon these walls. I mean, defensive prowess is the thing that you would expect from this unit, and they have provided. And the trolls falling away now. Securing of the wall. Dunland not able to make an impression at the main gate. If they are going to make something happen, the attackers, it will surely be this approach that it will be on. Nazkai still at the spearhead of their efforts over here. Medicel Guard struggling against the sheer numbers that they're committing now. They do have some reinforcements, another line of defence should the need arise. And the cavalry being used in an aggressive manner now, trying to hunt down the Dunlanders out here. Well, that's unfortunate. The charge out of the gate did not go as it did in the movies. The Rohan general does fall. Trying to put the pressure on the warband. Whatever happened to the Ravenborn Wardens that were over here? I mean, they're over there, but indecision perhaps from Johnny. That they were over here, then they moved over there. Now they're having to move back because there's no obvious way that you can use them at this stage. I think their presence is going to be needed in melee, but it might already be too late. Still with some Silverthorn arrows as well. A bad sign for the attackers, because this is where they're at their strongest, and any elven arrows that manage to find their mark is going to leave a mark. Another unit of Ravenborn Wardens over here, but again, they do have an angle, but at this point it's looking a little bit too little too late. HELMS, Hammers and Westmark Marshals arriving, probably going to bring about the end of the Nars Kai, and that is a real totem of quality for the attackers at this point. Losing it would be pretty tragic for them. Wardens, occasional clank of the crossbows, still the Guards of Orthanc fighting away. The Westmark Marshals trying to finish them off once and for all. At the moment it's only really the Elven Pikes and a couple of Sindar Blade Masters that are holding on over here. What is this? Snaga, who are fleeing. Ravenborn, who are trying this one again. Again, it's a good angle. It worked earlier on, but I don't think they have enough to be able to turn this fight around, especially when you consider that it is a unit of Dunnish warband that are having to deal with a full-blooded counter-attack from Escalating. Unfortunately for them, they flee, probably going to pursue the Ravenborn into the open field. I mean, surely the Sons of Aeol are going to be best suited to do that, and maybe up against a spear unit, but it will at least stop them from firing. Victory achieved here. Still, the attackers have got good advantage in terms of numbers over here. There's a few Beastmen of Dunland in there, a few stragglers from the Nars Kai unit, some pikes. Not enough to win the battle overall, I don't think, when all of the quality of the defenders that is left is consolidated, but could make their way further into the fortress yet. I've been impressed with Rohan, actually, in this fight. We've seen this kind of performance from Lothlorien before, but I think for anyone who is concerned about how effective Rohan can be as a infantry fighting force, this battle should lay those concerns to rest. Many of their units have been very impressive. They're heavy axemen, both the Riddermarks and the Westmark Marshals. The cavalry has been useful, but Escalating, HELMS, Hammers, everything has played its part from a Rohirrim perspective. The range support was good as well. Lothlorien's quality has certainly helped matters, but there you go. Good advertisement, I would suggest. Snargaskirmish is being chased by Galadhrim nobles, Uruk-hai pikemen moving forwards, Sindar Blade Masters switching priorities. Moving over here with the Westmark Marshals, some Shield Maidens. They are going to let these Uruk-hai pikemen in, but it's the only unit of infantry that Isengard still have attacking through this way. Hammers stand in their way. Smart Marshals. The Dunland General falls. Morale will take a hit. Especially given the pressure that they're under, this really is just a procession to victory at this point for all the defenders. Which I'm sure many people will be happy about. A defender victory. Rohan and the Elves showcasing their prowess against Isengard and Dunland. Back and forth this. I think the defenders do deserve it. I don't think the attackers did too much wrong. You can argue that maybe a more earnest effort to get their supporting units in place and trying to counteract the enemy's throwing projectile units and archers with their own more directly might have resulted in something a little bit more comfortable for them here later on, but when a battle gets chaotic like this one did, especially in stages down here in the lower fortress, it can be tricky to do that, and ultimately the defenders will play their part in that as well. Sometimes they simply will not let you do that, and they deserve all the credit here. They won it, the attackers did not lose it. Some Ravenborn Wardens trying to deal with this flanking force, which is mulching its way through all of this Snaga, unsurprisingly routing. Uruk-hai pikemen will rout as well. I think, just in general we're going to be seeing an awful lot of routing. The final death throes of the battle. We didn't get to see the interior, but then, like I said, from a defending perspective, when they were fighting in here, it was in their best interest to maintain fighting for the outer walls of the fortress. They were in a good position, and if you're in a good position, there's no need to try and change anything up. Routing the Uruk-hai pikes. Isengard gone. The Dunlanders will follow in short order. Some forces evenly matched. Victory is almost a certainty. I don't think so somehow with 200 frames left. And there goes the Dunland player, admitting defeat. And that is going to be that. Helm's Deep, defended successfully. It's quite a sight looking out over the walls and the fields. So, as the endgame splash screen shows up, big thank you to Flame of Rebellion for bringing this one in. I mean, the sheer amount of kills that the elves got, obviously very, very impressive, and a lot of that will come down. We won't actually be able to see it because I think we're viewing it from the perspective of the Rohan army, so we'll only be able to see theirs. But a huge amount of that will be as a result of their very damaging archers. I mean, this is the sort of situation where the elves are going to have a lot of joy. Rohan being the workhorse, really, for the initial stages of the fight, which is where the theme of the battle was really set early on, and it was in favour of the defenders. The attackers not able to quite really have that singular moment. They did when they took the lower fortress, that was good, but even then, as they were doing it and as they were sweeping through, they were still taking an awful lot of damage at the time they were claiming all of that territory. Tintin struggling a little bit more, but that's because he had to deal with the main gate, which is hard. Banana getting noticeably more kills than his allies, which is interesting. Be interesting to see what actually caused that. But having a look at what did the damage for Rohan, so Flame of the Rebellion, several units getting over 100, which is good. Helm's hammers being used more as a bludgeon than anything else. 249 on the Eastmark archers being his best unit, which, again, ranged units are always going to be really important in sieges like this, regardless of their tier. Having a look at what Lurking Shadow did, 211 on the Shield Maidens, the Helmengas, once again, just having a look at the Westmark Marshals and the Riddermark Axemen, just generally holding things down quite nicely. Some units not breaking 100, but many of those, stuff like Eastmark Spearmen and Westmark Spearmen, which are more defensively minded units anyway. More of a chaotic spread for China number 1, with, again, 269 on Eastmark archers. So it goes to show that you should never discount even your lowliest projectile units in this sort of situation, because if you use them well, they will be one of the main things that you can base a victory around. But good to see Helm's Deep, this new version of it. Obviously, we saw the interior of the caves and the extra way into the fortress. We didn't see the town centre and the hall within Helm's Deep on this occasion. There was no need. But it's, again, another good improvement on an already existing map. This was probably one of the ones that was not as sweeping a change as many of the others. Just like with Edoras, really, all of the Rohirrim maps tend to have had, refinements more so than complete overhauls in the way that other faction capital maps tended to have. But again, it's nice to see. Big thank you to Flame of the Rebellion, once again. Big thank you to all of the players that were a part of this battle replay. The schedule will remain as is. We'll be doing one faction overview and one battle replay a week for the foreseeable, at least until all the faction overviews are done, and there's still plenty of those left to go. I think by the time this one comes out, the next one of those will be Harad. The next replay that I do will either be one on a Region or one on a custom scenario that I just got sent. Again, trying to judge what order to do things in is always interesting. But yes, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.